They traded her like a sack of flour to a man they called a monster. But the real monster wasn't the one in chains. The first time Adeline saw him, his hands were bound and bloodied, and the sheriff spit the words "avage" like it was a piece of rotten meat on his tongue. But the man didn't lower his head, not once. Not even when the townspeople jeered, their faces twisted with a kind of righteous hatred that was uglier than any scar. Someone threw a rock. It caught the corner of his brow and drew a line of dark blood down his temple. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, a statue carved from granite and fury, his quiet strength more terrifying than any scream. They chained him to the post outside the trading office, right under the blistering sun, like he was nothing more than a stray dog. His shirt was torn, his boots were gone, and his back was a road map of suffering, scored with the pale, raised lines of a whip. Adeline had never seen someone look so completely out of place in a town that prided itself on being loud and pious. She should have walked away. Everyone else did. They threw their insults and their stones, and then went about their day, satisfied with their own goodness. But something about the way he didn't break, it froze her. Something about the impossible calm that settled in his dark eyes held her there on the dusty street. Her father grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. "Keep walking, girl," he hissed, his voice low and urgent. He tugged her away, but her eyes stayed locked with the man's. In that moment, a silent message passed between them. It wasn't about pity. It was about recognition. She saw a soul caged, and he saw, well, she didn't know what he saw. He just looked right through her. And he didn't blink. 3 days later, her father came to her in the pale morning light, his face gaunt, his eyes refusing to meet hers. He told her she was to be married, to him, the savage. He didn't say it like a question. He didn't even have the decency to look ashamed. It was a sentence, handed down without a trial. The snow hadn't melted yet on the high ridges surrounding Hollow Bend, and the wind carried a bite that felt personal, but Adeline barely felt it. A deeper cold had settled in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. Her hands trembled as she packed a single, pathetic bundle of her belongings. She wasn't angry, not yet. The shock was too great, a thick blanket smothering every other feeling. She was just empty. Her stepmother, Ruth, stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of pinched satisfaction. She pressed a bonnet into Adeline's hands, a gesture that was meant to look like kindness, but felt like a final insult. "Better you than one of us," Ruth muttered, and the words were not comfort. They were cowardice, plain and simple. Her father, a man who once taught her how to ride, a man who once held her when she scraped her knee, couldn't even look at her. "It's the only way, Ada," he mumbled to the floorboards. "The only way to keep the ranch, to pay the debt." A debt. He was trading his own daughter to settle a debt. "They say he's half Comanche, half cursed," Ruth added, her voice laced with a cruel sort of glee. "They say he killed 2 men up near the Black Fork, with his bare hands. That's what we're giving you to." Adeline looked from her father's slumped shoulders to her stepmother's smug face, and she understood. This wasn't just about a debt. This was an execution of a different kind. They weren't just getting rid of a financial burden, they were getting rid of her. But what choice did she have? In this world, a woman was property. First her father's, and now his. The wedding wasn't a wedding. It was a transaction, cold and public. There was no preacher, no ring, no gentle words. Just Sheriff Dalton, his belly straining the buttons of his uniform, standing in the mud outside his office. He unchained the man, tossing him a clean shirt and a sheathed knife. The metal of the cuffs fell to the dirt with a dull thud. "She's yours now," the sheriff grunted, shoving a piece of paper into the man's hand. He didn't even look at Adeline. The town didn't gather to celebrate. They gathered to watch, to stare, to confirm that the inconvenience of Adeline's existence had finally been dealt with. It was a spectacle, and the man, Her new husband, he didn't touch her. He didn't speak to her. He just took the reins of the tired-looking mule they'd given them, his movements economical and precise. He turned and started walking west, away from the town, into the vast, unforgiving brush. She followed, because there was nothing else to do, nowhere else to go. She was a ghost in her own life, trailing behind a man whose name she didn't even know. As they left the last sad shacks of Hollow Bend behind, Adeline risked a glance over her shoulder. She saw her father standing in the doorway of their home. He was watching her go, and then she saw something that made the cold in her veins turn to ice. Sheriff Dalton walked up to her father, and her father. He handed the sheriff a small, heavy-looking bag of coins. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a payment for the ranch. This was a payment for something else entirely. The sheriff hadn't just overseen the deal. He'd brokered it. He'd profited from it. They hadn't just sold her to pay a debt. They had paid someone to take her away. They walked for what felt like an eternity. The dusty streets of Hollow Bend gave way to grassy plains, which then hardened into rocky, unforgiving terrain. The sun beat down, relentless. The silence between them was a third presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. Adeline's mind replayed the scene over and over. Her father, the sheriff, the bag of coins. The debt was a lie. Or at least it wasn't the whole truth. They wanted her gone. But why? Was she just a burden, or was it something more? What had she done to be so thoroughly discarded? Every step she took away from that town felt like a step into nothingness. She was walking behind a complete stranger, a man the world called a killer, into a wilderness that would just as soon swallow her whole. At least in town, the cruelty had a face. Out here, it was faceless, formless, and everywhere. The man never looked back. He moved with a steady, ground-eating pace, his shoulders straight, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He seemed as much a part of the harsh landscape as the rocks and the twisted, sun-scorched trees. He belonged here. She did not. Finally, as the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and purple, he stopped. The trees had thinned, and the ground rose and fell in long, dusty ridges that seemed to go on forever. He glanced over his shoulder, and his eyes met hers. For the first time, she saw something other than that unnerving calm. It was a flicker of something. Annoyance? Pity? She couldn't tell. He spoke, and his voice was like the crunch of gravel under a boot. "I am not your jailer." Adeline blinked, startled. It was the first time she had heard him speak, and the sound was deeper, rougher than she could have imagined. He paused, his gaze sweeping over her torn dress, her frightened face. "You can leave," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He gestured with his chin back towards the east, towards the town that had cast her out. "I won't follow." Adeline stared at him, a raw, bitter laugh threatening to bubble up from her chest. Leave? He was offering her the one thing she thought she'd never have again, and it was the most useless gift in the world. "And go where?" she shot back, the words sharper than she intended. "Back to the town that sold me like a heifer? Back to the father who paid a man to haul me away? You think I have a home left?" A muscle in his jaw twitched, just a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. But it was a reaction. She had gotten a reaction. Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. He turned his back on her and kept walking, the conversation apparently over. They made camp that night in a narrow canyon beside a stream that trickled weakly over smooth stones. He didn't offer her food, didn't make small talk, didn't acknowledge her existence beyond the fact that they were occupying the same small patch of dirt. But he gathered wood with an efficient grace, built a fire with a few swift movements, and then he took the single, coarse blanket they'd been given and tossed it to her. He slept without one, his back pressed against a cold slab of rock, his arms crossed over his chest. He didn't shiver. He didn't move. He just was. Adeline didn't sleep at all. She sat huddled in the blanket, the knife he'd been given lying near her feet, and watched him. She watched the way the firelight played over the hard lines of his face, the way his chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Who was this man? Was he the monster they said he was? A killer? A curse? Or was he something else? She clutched the blanket tighter. The town had given him a knife. They had given a so-called savage a weapon. It didn't make any sense, unless they wanted something to happen to her out here. Unless they were hoping he would use it. The thought sent a fresh wave of terror through her. Her father and the sheriff hadn't just gotten rid of her. They had arranged her murder. The days bled into one another, each one a copy of the last. A silent march under a hostile sun. A silent camp under a blanket of indifferent stars. The man, her husband, spoke only when necessary, his words clipped and functional. Water here. Storm coming. Walk faster. Adeline watched him. She learned him. She saw the way he read the land like a book, the way he could find water where she saw only cracked earth, the way he could trap a rabbit with a snare made from nothing but a vine and a bent stick. He knew how to survive. She, on the other hand, was useless. She knew how to set a table, how to churn butter, how to mend a stocking, skills that were worth less than nothing out here. She was a liability, and she knew it. He had to know it too. Yet there was no cruelty in him. There was no glint of the unhinged rage the townspeople had described. There was just a quiet, profound weariness, the look of a man who had been betrayed so many times he was simply waiting for the next blow to fall. It made her wonder about the scars on his back. Who had put them there? Why? She didn't even know his name. It was a strange, intimate sort of ignorance. To share a fire with a man, to sleep only a few feet from him, to have her entire life bound to his, and not know what to call him. Then, on the 5th night, as he was expertly cleaning a fish by the stream, he spoke without being spoken to. Koasati, he said, his eyes on his work. My mother's people named me that. Adeline held her breath, not wanting to break the fragile truce. He glanced up, his dark eyes catching the last of the fading light. The white men call me Elias. I let them. It keeps the peace. Elias, she repeated softly. The name felt strange on her tongue, but it suited him. It was a strong, simple name. Not because it was his, but because he had allowed her to have it. It was the first thing he had truly given her. They didn't touch, not in those early days. He never presumed, never crowded her, never even looked at her with the kind of hungry assessment she was used to from the men in town. He treated her like she was a ghost, something fragile and distant, and not quite there. That respect, that distance, was a strange sort of kindness. It confused her. He had been given her, like a piece of meat, but he refused to take what the town had declared was his. He had built a wall around himself, high and impenetrable, and he seemed determined to keep her on the other side of it. But walls can't keep everything out. One night, a coyote came close to the camp. Too close. Adeline heard it sniffing around the edges of their small clearing while Elias was away, checking his snares. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs, every childhood horror story coming to life in the shadows. Then it growled, a low guttural sound that vibrated through the ground. It was circling near the mule, its eyes glowing like hot coals in the dark. And something inside Adeline snapped. Fear gave way to a surge of fierce, protective anger. She wasn't going to die out here. She wasn't going to be some animal's meal. She reached for the only weapon she had, his knife. She stood with it clutched in her shaking hand, her breath coming in shallow pants, the coyote growling, circling closer. And then suddenly, he was there, silent as fog. One moment the space beside her was empty. The next, Elias was standing there, his presence a solid, calming weight in the terrifying dark. He didn't make a sound. He simply put his hand around her wrist, his grip firm but gentle, and turned her hand so the blade was pointing at the ground. "It's gone," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It smelled the blood from the rabbits. It won't come back." She couldn't lower the knife. Her fingers were locked around the hilt, her arm trembling with leftover adrenaline. "You're safe," he added quietly. That night, when he laid out his sleeping spot, he moved it closer to hers. Not touching, not crowding, but close enough that she could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing in the dark. Close enough that she knew if the coyote came back, he would be there. And for the first time since the town of Hollow Bend had sold her soul, Adeline slept. But safety is a fragile thing in a land that has none. And they weren't alone in those canyons. They were being watched. Safety was a borrowed blanket, warm for a moment, but easily snatched away. Elias knew it before she did. He didn't say anything at first, but Adeline wasn't the same terrified girl who had stumbled out of Hollow Bend. She had learned to read his silence, and his silence was now screaming. She saw the subtle shift in him, the way his eyes constantly scanned the ridgelines, the way he started walking behind her on the narrow trails instead of in front, placing his body between her and any potential threat. At night, he no longer left the knife by her side. He slept with it in his hand. The air grew heavy with unspoken tension. The wilderness, which had started to feel like a neutral space, now felt like a trap, its silence filled with hostile eyes. "What is it?" She finally asked one morning, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to give voice to her fear. "Men," he said, that was all. And it was enough. That night they didn't camp by the stream. Elias led them high up into the rocks, to a shallow cave shielded by a thicket of thorny brush. He didn't light a fire. The darkness was a suffocating blanket, and the cold was sharp. He sat with his back to hers, a silent guardian watching the path they had just traveled. "Will they follow us?" she whispered into the dark, the words swallowed by the vast emptiness. His voice came back, a low vibration against her spine. "They already are." The next morning, the world ended. One of the men stepped into their path as they were making their way down a rocky slope. He emerged from behind a boulder like he owned the very ground they stood on. He was tall and scarred, with a cruel smile that didn't come anywhere near his cold, dead eyes. "Well now," he said, his voice a slimy drawl. He wasn't looking at Elias. His eyes were fixed on Adeline, crawling over her like insects. "Ain't you a pretty one to find all the way out here? Didn't think Comanche dogs took white brides." Elias moved without a sound, stepping between Adeline and the man. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. His body was a wall of solid rock. The scarred man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "What's this? You guarding her now? I thought you people just took what you wanted." Still, Elias said nothing. But his stance shifted. The quiet weariness she had grown used to was gone, replaced by something ancient and lethal. It was like watching a stone remember that it could be a blade. More men appeared from the rocks, fanning out, blocking any chance of escape. Adeline counted 3, then 4. They all had guns holstered at their hips. They all had the same predatory look in their eyes. They had guns. Elias had a knife. "Run," she whispered, a desperate plea. "Elias, run!" He didn't move. He didn't even look at her. His focus was entirely on the man in front of him. The outlaw leader grinned wider, showing a row of yellowed teeth. "You really gonna die for her, savage? She ain't worth it." For the first time, Elias looked back at Adeline. It was just a glance, a flicker of an eye, but in that fraction of a second, she saw something she had never seen before. It wasn't fear, it wasn't anger, it was a promise. Then he turned back to the outlaw and said one word, his voice low and final. "Yes." The world exploded. Elias didn't throw the first punch. He waited, a study in deadly patience. But the moment the outlaw sneered and his hand dropped towards the hilt of his revolver, the stillness inside Elias shattered. His movement was a blur, a sudden shocking explosion of speed that was too fast for Adeline's eyes to track. One moment, the outlaw was reaching for his gun. The next, his wrist was caught mid-draw, twisted at an impossible angle. A sickening snap echoed through the canyon, and the gun clattered uselessly to the dirt. The other outlaws weren't laughing anymore. The second man lunged, a long blade flashing in the morning sun. Elias ducked under the wild swing, his body impossibly low to the ground, and drove his shoulder into the man's gut. The outlaw slammed backward into a tree trunk, his head hitting the bark with a wet crack. He slid to the ground and didn't move. By the time the third man had his pistol raised, Elias had already snatched the fallen blade from the dirt. It wasn't a clean fight. It was brutal and desperate. The third man fired. The bullet ripped through the flesh of Elias's upper arm. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry out. A line of red blossomed on his sleeve, but he just kept moving forward with that same terrifying, inhuman grace. And then his knife, the outlaw's own blade, was buried deep in the gunman's side. The man's eyes went wide with shock, and he crumpled to his knees, clutching the wound. Adeline couldn't breathe. She was frozen, a spectator to a level of violence she couldn't comprehend. Blood soaked the dusty ground, turning it a dark, ugly red. The last outlaw, his face pale with terror, scrambled to his feet. He didn't try to fight. He grabbed the reins of their mule and fled, crashing through the brush like a panicked deer. Elias didn't chase him. He stood there, chest heaving, blood dripping from his arm onto the rocks. He staggered slightly, pressing a hand to the wound, and then he turned slowly to face her. His eyes were dark, haunted. "They'll be back," he said, his voice low and steady but strained with pain. "With more." And that's when Adeline realized something that chilled her to the bone. These weren't just random outlaws. Their leader had called Elias a Comanche dog, but then he'd said, "She ain't worth it," as if he knew who she was. They weren't just here for him, they were here for her. But who were they? The world tilted on its axis and Adeline finally moved. The spell of horrified paralysis broke and a new feeling surged through her, a fierce, cold rage. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her petticoat without a second thought, the sound of tearing fabric unnaturally loud in the sudden silence. She went to him, her hands trembling but her purpose firm. He watched her approach, his eyes unreadable, as she began to wrap the makeshift bandage around his bleeding arm. He didn't stop her. He didn't help her. He just stood there, letting her tend to him, his gaze fixed on her face the entire time. It was as if he was trying to solve a puzzle, and she was the missing piece. "We need to go," he said, his voice a low rasp, as soon as she tied the knot. "Now." They left everything. The blankets, the small pouch of dried meat they had left, even their last water skin. They took only the knife and themselves, heading north, deeper into the wilderness, towards the jagged, foreboding peaks of the Blacktooth Range. The one mule was gone, which meant they were on foot. Hunted. The sky darkened with a speed that felt ominous. Adeline's legs ached, a deep, burning pain that went all the way to the bone. Her lungs burned in the thin, cold air. But she didn't complain. She couldn't. The man beside her was bleeding, his face pale and tight with pain, yet he pushed onward, his pace relentless. That night they found a small cave, its entrance half hidden by a curtain of thorny brambles. Elias practically collapsed once they were inside, the last of his strength finally giving out. The blood had soaked through her bandage, staining his shirt a dark, horrifying crimson. Adeline forced him to sit, her fear a cold, hard knot in her stomach. Using the last of the clean cloth from her petticoat and icy water from a nearby stream, she cleaned the wound as best she could. It was deep and ragged. The bullet was still in there. She could feel it. A fever was already setting in. His skin was hot to the touch, and a fine sheen of sweat covered his brow. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice choked with a mixture of awe and terror. He opened his eyes, his gaze hazy with pain. "You didn't need saving," he replied, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You just needed someone to stand in the way." She stared at him, the flickering light of the tiny fire she'd managed to build, casting dancing shadows across his face. The fire was a risk, she knew. The men who were hunting them could see it, but the cold was seeping into him, and she was more afraid of the fever than she was of them. "Why do they hate you so much?" she asked. the question that had been haunting her since that first day in town. Elias closed his eyes, a flicker of pain crossing his features. He was listening, not just to her, but to the sounds of the night beyond their shelter. "My mother was Comanche," he said, his voice barely audible. "My father was white. I was born between two worlds, and I never belonged to either one." He took a ragged breath. "Too pale for the tribe's winter camps, too dark for the white man's towns. So they gave me a name, Savage. It made it easier for them. It meant they didn't have to see me as a man. It meant they could hate me without guilt." Adeline looked down, a hot wave of shame washing over her. Her people, her town, her own father, they had done this to him. "And now you're tied to me," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "Another white man's burden." He shook his head, a slow, deliberate movement. "I'm not tied to anything," he said, and his eyes opened, finding hers in the dim light. They were surprisingly clear for a moment. "I chose this. I chose to stay." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and profound. He had chosen to stand for her. He had chosen to bleed for her. And she still didn't understand why. But as she watched his fever climb, as she listened to his pained, shallow breathing in the dark, she made a choice of her own. He had stood in the way for her. Now, she would stand in the way for him. Whatever was coming, it would have to go through her first. But she had a terrible feeling that the men hunting them weren't the only threat. The outlaw who had fled on their mule, he wasn't just going back for more men. He was going back to collect a bounty that had been placed not just on Elias, but on her too. The fever was a relentless tide, pulling Elias under. For 3 days and 3 nights, Adeline didn't leave the small, cold cave. She was a sentry, a nurse, a ghost haunting the edges of his delirium. She kept the fire small, just enough to ward off the deepest chill, and she spent the hours bathing his face with cool water, forcing sips of broth she'd made from a scrawny bird she'd managed to trap, and listening. Always listening. He drifted in and out of consciousness, lost in a landscape of nightmares. He muttered in the Comanche tongue, the words sharp and pained. Other times he spoke English, fragmented phrases that gave her glimpses into a life of hurt. Not enough. Never enough. And once, a name that made her blood run cold. Isabel. "I'm sorry." Who was Isabel? A wife? A sister? A lover? The question stabbed at her, a strange and unwelcome pang of jealousy. He had a past, a history of pain she knew nothing about. She was just the latest chapter in his book of suffering. On the 4th morning, she woke from a fitful doze to find him staring at her. His eyes were clear. The fever had broken. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice weak but firm. Relief washed over her so intensely it made her dizzy. "Where can we go?" she asked, her voice trembling. "They're everywhere." "North," he said, pushing himself into a sitting position with a grimace of pain. "There's land over the spine of the mountain. It's dangerous country. Most men won't ride there. They fear what lives in those woods more than they fear a bounty." Adeline hesitated, a new fear creeping in. "And you? Do you fear it?" He looked at her, his gaze steady and direct. He reached out and touched her wrist, his fingers cool against her skin. It was the first time he had touched her by choice. "No," he said softly. "Not with you." The simple words, the gentle touch, they did something to the walls around her heart. A small crack appeared. They left before midday. The climb was brutal, a rough, jagged ascent up crumbling paths that threatened to give way with every step. Elias, though still weak, took the lead, his knowledge of the terrain unerring. He moved with a quiet confidence that belied the agony she knew he must be in. Adeline followed close behind, her hand often brushing against the rough stone walls for balance, her eyes fixed on his back. He was her compass now, her only true north. That night, they camped on a narrow, wind-swept shelf of rock, overlooking a vast, dark valley of evergreens. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, but the sky was a tapestry of brilliant, cold stars. It was so beautiful it made her chest ache. They ate the last of the dried bird in silence, the quiet between them no longer heavy, but comfortable, companionable. "Did you ever have someone?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. She was thinking of the name he'd called out in his fever. Isabel. He stared into the darkness for a long time, and she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he shook his head. "Once," he said, his voice low and rough with memory. "A long time ago. She died before I could build her a home." Adeline's heart clenched. She didn't ask how. The pain in his voice was a closed door she dared not open. Instead, she did something she never would have imagined doing just a week ago. She reached out and laid her hand over his. His hand was calloused and hard, but it was warm. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. They sat there for a long time, holding hands under the starlight, two lonely souls on the edge of the world. The farther they climbed, the colder it grew. Frost limned the edges of the pine needles, and their breath plumed in the air like smoke. Elias was getting stronger every day. He taught her things. He showed her how to set a snare that wouldn't fail, how to skin a rabbit with quick, clean movements. He pointed out which berries would kill you and which would save you. He taught her how to read the wind and how to walk on snow without making a sound. She was a quick study. She had to be. Survival was a lesson with a harsh teacher. Every night, their sleeping rolls were a little closer. The invisible wall between them was crumbling, stone by stone. They talked more, sharing small pieces of their pasts. She told him about her mother, who had loved books. He told her about his, who had taught him the names of the stars in the Comanche tongue. They were building something fragile and new in the ruins of their old lives. A tentative trust, a quiet hope. Then came the morning they woke up to hoof prints in the fresh snow. They weren't theirs. They were fresh, circling the small grove of trees where they had made their camp. Shod horses, white men's horses. "They found us," Elias said, his voice flat and devoid of surprise. He was already kicking snow over the embers of their fire, erasing any sign of their presence. Adeline's heart, which had just started to feel light, turned to a leaden weight in her chest. "What do we do?" He looked at her, and the warmth she had seen in his eyes over the past few days was gone, replaced by a hard, calculating glint. He looked at her for a long, painful moment. "We split up," he said. "No," she said instantly, the word a raw protest. "I'm not leaving you." "It's the only way," he insisted, his voice sharp. "I'll lead them east, back down the mountain. They're hunting me, not you. You ride west. There's an old trapper's cabin by a frozen lake 2 days' ride from here. It's abandoned. You'll be safe there. Wait for me." "I won't," she said, her voice breaking. "They'll kill you." "They'll try," he said with a grim finality. He took her by the shoulders, his grip firm. "Adeline, you have to." He pressed the knife into her hand, wrapping her cold fingers around the hilt. "You saved my life in that cave. Now let me save yours." He lifted her onto the back of the small, shaggy pony they had acquired from a wild herd. He slapped its rump, and the animal bolted, carrying her away from him, into the dense, snow-laden forest. She looked back once, through a blur of tears. He was standing there, a lone figure against the vast white emptiness, watching her go. Then he turned and walked east, deliberately leaving a clear trail for the hunters to follow. She rode. Every beat of the pony's hooves on the snow was a drumbeat of guilt and terror. She reached the lake by dusk, just as the sky broke open, releasing a blinding curtain of snow. The cabin was there, just as he'd promised. Small, sagging, and half-buried in a drift, but it was shelter. It was dry. She built a fire, waited, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. 2 days passed. Then 3. The world was nothing but white silence and the howl of the wind. On the 3rd night, she thought she heard hoofbeats. She ran out into the blizzard, barefoot in the snow, screaming his name until her throat was raw. There was only silence and the falling snow. On the fourth day, she opened the cabin door to a world remade in white, and there, leading up to her door, was a single trail. A trail of blood. Heavy boot prints, 1 foot dragging, and splatters of crimson staining the pristine snow. Her heart stopped. She followed the trail with her eyes from the edge of the trees to her doorstep, and there, leaning against the doorframe, swaying like a tree in a storm, was Elias. His coat was torn open, and one whole side of his body was soaked in blood. He looked up at her, a faint, pained smile touching his lips. He collapsed before he could say a word. She caught him just before his head hit the hard-planked floor. The world narrowed to the cabin, the howling wind, and the man bleeding out in her arms. There was a fresh bullet wound in his side, low and deep, and a vicious gash across his ribs that looked like it had been made by a hunting knife. He had led them away. He had fought them, and he had won. But it had cost him everything. She worked through the night, a frantic, desperate battle against death itself. Her hands, which he had taught to be steady, shook as she cut away his bloody shirt and cleaned the wounds. She heated the tip of the knife in the fire, the same knife he had given her, and with a prayer on her lips and tears streaming down her face, she dug the bullet out of his side. He didn't wake until the sun returned, its pale light filtering through the cabin's single grimy window. "You came back," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken thing. She was exhausted, covered in his blood, but she had never felt more alive. He opened his eyes, and they were clear. He smiled, a weak but genuine smile. "Didn't I say I would?" "You shouldn't have," she sobbed, relief and anger warring inside her. "You should have run!" "I had to," he rasped, his hand finding hers. They had a poster from the sheriff in Hollow Bend, a bounty. Adeline froze. "For you?" He shook his head slightly. "For you," he whispered. "Wanted. For the murder of your stepmother, Ruth." Adeline's world, which had just been pieced back together, shattered into a million pieces. Ruth, the gunshot in the woods, the bounty hunter. It hadn't been a random attack, it had been a setup. The bounty hunter had killed Ruth, and the sheriff was blaming her. They hadn't just sold her, hadn't just tried to have her killed by Elias, hadn't just hunted her with outlaws. Now they had made her a murderer. There was nowhere on earth she could go where she would be safe. Except here, in this cabin, with this man. That night, they lay side by side on the cabin floor, wrapped in every blanket they could find. He was weak, but he was alive. He reached for her hand in the dark. "You were never a prisoner, Adeline," he said, his voice quiet but strong. "Not to me." She pressed her forehead against his, the tears finally coming. Not tears of fear or grief, but of something else entirely. Something new. "You're the only place," she whispered, "I have ever felt safe." Outside, the snow fell in a deep, healing silence. Inside, she knew, with a certainty that shook her to her very soul, that this man was no longer her protector or her captor. He was her home. But the sheriff of Hollow Bend was still out there, and he wasn't the kind of man to let a bounty go unclaimed. He would come for his property. He would come for her. Spring came to the mountains, not as a gentle thaw, but as a violent tearing. The melting snow turned streams into raging torrents, flooding gullies and pulling ancient trees from the earth. But inside the small cabin by the lake, the world seemed to be healing in softer ways. Elias healed slowly. The bullet had missed his vital organs, but a deep, stubborn fever clung to him for weeks. Adeline never left his side. She became an expert in the quiet arts of healing, spoon-feeding him broth boiled from rabbit bones, wiping the sweat from his brow, and reading to him from a tattered Bible some long-forgotten trapper had left behind. He didn't speak much in those first days, but he held her hand. Every time he opened his eyes, the first thing they searched for was her face. And she was always there. That, more than any medicine, seemed to be what pulled him back from the brink. By the second week, he could sit up. By the third, he could walk, leaning heavily on a staff he'd carved. Adeline would help him down to the edge of the lake on the rare sunny afternoons. He would lean against a large, flat boulder and watch the last of the ice floes drift lazily in the sun, his face thoughtful. It was there, in the fragile warmth of the new spring, that she told him everything, about the shame of being sold, about the coin her father had given the sheriff, about the final, crushing betrayal of being framed for a murder she didn't commit. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she confessed, her voice low, tracing patterns in the damp earth with a stick. "Not really." He was quiet for a long time, his gaze on the distant, snow-capped peaks. Then he looked at her, his dark eyes filled with a fierce intensity she had never seen before. "Then I'll make you a promise," he said. "I will never let them take that from you again. This place. Me. We are your safety now." Adeline smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, making them shimmer with unshed tears. "You don't have to promise me anything, Elias." "I already did," he said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. "That first day, in the town, when they chained me to that post, and you looked at me, not with hate or with fear, but with something else. I made a vow, in my own heart, that I would never be the savage they saw, that I would never be the monster they wanted me to be. I vowed that I would be the place you could finally rest." The days grew longer, warmer. Together they repaired the cabin's sagging roof with woven branches and pine resin. They tilled a small patch of damp soil near the tree line and planted the root vegetables she'd found growing wild. Life settled into a rhythm, a peaceful, domestic rhythm that felt both strange and wonderful. Sometimes Elias would return from a hunt with a brace of pheasants slung over his shoulder, and she would meet him at the door with a smile that filled the small cabin with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. And still, they hadn't said it. The words that pressed against their ribs, the truth that lived in the space between their hands when they accidentally brushed, the feeling that hummed in the quiet air between them. Then, one afternoon, just as the sun was turning the lake to molten gold, Adeline found something that made the peaceful rhythm of her heart stutter and stop. She had been gathering kindling behind the cabin when she saw them. Hoof prints, deep ones, new ones. Not from their little pony. These were from a large shod horse. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching them. She ran inside, her face pale, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Someone's been near the cabin." Elias didn't speak. He moved. With a fluid grace that was startling, he retrieved a long rifle from its hiding place beneath the floorboards. He slung the strap over his shoulder and stepped outside, his eyes scanning the trees, the shoreline, the very air itself. Adeline followed close behind him, every nerve ending screaming. The hoof prints led to the edge of the lake and then vanished. The tracks washed away at the muddy shore. "They're watching," Elias murmured, his voice a low growl. "Waiting." "Should we run?" Adeline asked, her voice cracking. "Again?" He turned to her, and the look on his face was grim. "They'd follow. They know we're here now. If it's the sheriff, he won't give up, not with a bounty to collect." His jaw tightened. "But my gut tells me this isn't the sheriff." "Then who?" "Worse," he said, and the single word sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the evening air. That night, neither of them slept. They sat together by the hearth, the rifle lying across Elias's lap, their hands clasped tightly together. The silence was thick with unspoken fears. Just before the dawn, as the sky began to lighten to a bruised purple, he turned to her. "There is a place," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Farther north, past the highest ridge. I haven't been there since I was a boy. It's a hard journey, but if we can make it, no one will follow us there. Not even the army." "What's there?" she whispered. He hesitated for a moment, and in that hesitation, she saw a universe of pain. "My people," he said finally. Or, what's left of them? Adeline stared at him. Go back to the people who saw his white blood as a stain? The people who had cast him out? You want to go back there? I want you to be safe, he said, his voice raw with an emotion he rarely showed. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. That's the only thing I want. They left that morning, packing what little they had. The rifle, a blanket, a small bag of dried meat, and a flint and steel. They left behind the little cabin that had been their sanctuary, their beginning, and stepped back into the unknown. The trail was steep and overgrown. They crossed rivers with water so cold it stole the breath from their lungs and numbed their legs to the bone. But they never looked back. On the 5th day, they reached the edge of a wide, hidden basin, ringed by hills that rose like a natural fortress. Elias stopped, kneeling down to touch the earth, as if greeting an old friend. He whispered something in the Comanche tongue, a word that sounded like a prayer. This is where I was born, he said softly, his voice thick with memory. This is where I saw my mother smile for the last time. Adeline stood beside him, her heart aching for him, for the boy he had been. Will they welcome us, Elias? I don't know, he admitted, his honesty a sharp pain in her chest. He stood up and took her hand, his grip strong and sure. But I will never let them take you from me. Not again. They crossed into the basin as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of rose and gray. In the distance, smoke rose from a cluster of fires, and then they saw them, shapes detaching from the twilight. 3 riders, approaching fast. Elias stepped in front of her, raising his hand, palm out, in a sign of peace. The riders reined in their horses about 20 paces away, their faces hard and unreadable in the dying light. One of them dismounted. It was a woman, lean and weathered, with streaks of silver in her long black braids, and a faded scar that ran from her temple to her chin. Her eyes were like chips of obsidian. She stared at Elias, her gaze sharp and penetrating, and then she spoke his Comanche name, Coasati. He nodded once, a gesture of respect. The woman's gaze shifted, landing on Adeline. It was a heavy, assessing look. She is white, the woman stated, her voice flat. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply said, She is mine. That single word, mine, hung in the still air. It wasn't a word of ownership, like her father or the sheriff would have used. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of loyalty. It was a shield. Adeline felt its power, its finality, its absolute truth, and it settled deep in her soul. The woman studied them both for a long, silent moment. Then she gave a short, sharp nod and motioned for them to follow. Come, she said. But as they walked towards the camp, towards a new and uncertain future, Adeline saw something that made her blood run cold. On the saddle of the old woman's horse, tied with a leather thong, was a familiar-looking pouch. It was the same kind of pouch, with the same distinctive beading that the outlaw leader had been wearing. The man Elias had killed in the canyon. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a trap. The camp was small, a dozen or so tents made of canvas and stretched hide, huddled together for warmth and safety. Children with wide, curious eyes peered out from behind tent flaps as they passed. Elders, their faces maps of hardship, watched them with a silent, unnerving scrutiny. This was a world Adeline did not understand, a place where she was the outsider, the alien, the threat. The old woman, Elias's aunt, he later told her, led them to a fire and gave them food and a blanket. It was a gesture of hospitality, but there was no warmth in it. The entire camp seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. Later that night, Elias sat with his aunt and the other elders. Adeline stayed back by their small fire, pretending to be busy mending a tear in her dress. She couldn't hear their words, only the low, guttural murmur of the Comanche language, but she could see the tension in Elias's shoulders, the hard set of his jaw. His eyes, however, kept finding hers across the flickering flames. a silent reassurance, a lifeline in this sea of suspicion. He returned to her long after the moon had risen, his face weary. "She is called Tiva," he said quietly, sitting down beside her. "She remembered me. She remembered my mother." He paused. "She will let us stay, for now." Adeline touched his hand. "Do you still want to leave?" He looked at her, and the weariness in his face was replaced by a fierce determination. "I want to build something," he said, his voice low and intense. "A life, here, with you." They stayed. Spring deepened into a lush, green summer. Adeline, determined to earn her place, worked harder than she ever had in her life. She helped the women tend their gardens of corn and squash, her hands becoming calloused and strong. She learned to stitch tough deer hide with a bone needle and sinew. She learned the power of silence, to speak only when necessary, to listen more than she talked. They didn't ask about her past. They judged her by her actions, not by the color of her skin. They watched her, and slowly, very slowly, the suspicion in their eyes began to fade, replaced by a grudging respect. Elias hunted. He trapped. He repaired saddles and taught the young boys the proper way to fletch an arrow. He was reclaiming a part of himself he had long thought lost. But every night, no matter how tired he was, he came back to her. He came back to their small tent, to their shared fire, and the space between them narrowed until it disappeared completely. One night, under a sky littered with 1,000,000 brilliant stars, she reached out and touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "I don't just want to be safe, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. "I want to be yours." He didn't answer with words. He answered by closing the last tiny distance between them, his lips finding hers in the darkness. It wasn't a kiss of passion, but of homecoming, a quiet, profound acknowledgement of everything they had survived and everything they had found in each other. They shared a blanket that night, and when the dawn came, it found them tangled together. A new, unbreakable quiet settled between them. But peace is a fleeting ghost in a land haunted by violence. 3 weeks later, a scout returned to the camp, his horse lathered, his eyes wide with terror. "Men are coming," he gasped, sliding from his horse. "Raiders! A whole company of them! They're burning everything in their path!" He looked at Elias, then at Adeline, and his next words struck her like a physical blow. "They're led by a man from Hollow Bend, the sheriff." The sheriff. He hadn't given up. He had tracked them. He had found them. And he was coming to collect his bounty and burn their world to the ground. "We have to leave," Adeline said instantly, her blood running cold. "We have to run." Elias looked at her, then at the faces of the people around them, the children playing, the women grinding corn, the old men smoking their pipes. "No," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Not this time. This time we stand." And stand they did. The camp transformed. Elias, no longer an outcast, but a leader, trained every able-bodied person to fight. Men, women, even the older children learned to draw a bow, to wield a spear. Adeline, the woman who had once been afraid of a coyote, now helped build barricades of sharpened logs and rocks. She boiled pots of pitch to be poured on their attackers. She didn't sleep. None of them did. They were a community forged in the fire of desperation. On the 4th morning, a cloud of dust rose on the southern ridge. They were here. Adeline stood beside Elias on the rise above the camp, her rifle in her hands, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. He took her hand, his grip steady and strong. "Adeline," he said, his voice low and serious, "no matter what happens today, I need you to remember something." "What?" she asked, her throat tight. "That I was never a savage," he said, his eyes locking with hers. "I was just a man who found his soul when he found you." She couldn't speak. She could only nod, tears burning behind her eyes, as the first wave of riders crested the ridge, their guns glinting in the morning sun. The battle was a nightmare of screams, smoke, and blood. The first wave of the sheriff's men was pushed back by a volley of fire arrows that turned the dry grass into a wall of flame. The second wave, larger and more determined, broke through the barricades. Elias fought like a storm made flesh. He moved through the chaos, his staff a blur, his movements a deadly dance. He was protecting his home, his people, his wife. He was no longer the man in chains. He was a king defending his kingdom, but even kings can fall. Adeline saw it happen. A lucky shot from a pistol. Elias staggered, clutching his shoulder, and went down. "No!" The scream was ripped from her throat. She ran, heedless of the bullets zipping past her head, her only thought to get to him. She reached him just as the sheriff himself, his face red and contorted with rage, broke through the line of defenders. He was on foot, a massive figure, a revolver in his hand. He saw Elias on the ground, wounded, and a triumphant, ugly sneer spread across his face. He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Elias's heart. Adeline reached Elias, dropping to her knees beside him, pressing her hands to the wound. "Elias," she sobbed. He smiled up at her, a pained, bloody smile. "You're still my safe place," he whispered. The sheriff took his final aim. But from the tree line another figure emerged. A man, tall and broad, lifting a rifle. But he wasn't one of the raiders. He was dressed in the blue uniform of the United States Army, and his rifle wasn't aimed at the sheriff. It was aimed at Elias. Adeline didn't think. She didn't plan. She acted. She yanked the pistol from Elias's belt, the one he had carried since the cabin. She had never fired a gun in her life. She pointed it at the sheriff, her hand shaking, and pulled the trigger. The world exploded in a deafening roar. The gun kicked back, bruising her hand, but her aim was true. The sheriff's triumphant sneer vanished, replaced by a look of utter shock. A small, dark hole appeared in the center of his chest. He staggered backward, his own gun firing uselessly into the sky, and then he collapsed in a heap, his reign of terror finally over. But the danger wasn't gone. The soldier in the blue uniform, seeing his chance, readjusted his aim. His target was still Elias. Another shot cracked through the air, but it wasn't from the soldier's rifle. It came from the side. The soldier cried out, dropping his weapon and clutching his leg, a bloom of red spreading across his blue trousers. Adeline looked up, her heart in her throat, and saw him. Her past, walking out of the smoke and chaos like a ghost. A man she thought she had left behind forever. Captain Jacob Breyer, her former fiancé, the man who had left her to be sold. And behind him, dismounting from their horses, was a full patrol of U.S. cavalry soldiers. They hadn't come to save the Comanche. They had come to wipe them out. The raiders were just the appetizer. The army was the main course. And she, Adeline, had just killed a white sheriff in front of a dozen witnesses. She was no longer just a wanted murderer. She was a cop killer, an enemy of the state. Jacob's face was a mask of cold fury and disbelief. His eyes weren't on the wounded soldier, or the dead sheriff, or the chaos of the battle. They were on her, kneeling in the dirt, covered in blood, with a smoking pistol in her hand, cradling the head of the man he saw only as a savage. "Adeline?" he choked out, the name a strange, foreign sound in this place of death. "My God, what have you become?" What had she become? The question echoed in the sudden, ringing silence of the battlefield. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall and the army arrive, were scattering, melting back into the hills. The Comanche warriors, seeing the blue-coated soldiers, paused, their faces grim. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. Adeline looked down at Elias. His breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering closed. The new wound in his shoulder was bleeding badly. He was fading. "I became what I had to," she said, her voice low and fierce, not looking at Jacob. "I became a survivor." Jacob took a step forward, his handsome face a storm of conflicting emotions. "A survivor? Look at you. You're with him. You killed a lawman to protect him." "That man was not a lawman," Adeline spat, her gaze finally lifting to meet his. "He was a monster. He framed me for a murder I didn't commit. He put a bounty on my head. He came here to slaughter innocent people." Innocent! Jacob laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. He gestured to the Comanche warriors who were now gathering around Elias, their faces hard and suspicious. There are no innocent people here, Adeline, only soldiers and savages. Tiva, Elias's aunt, pushed her way through the warriors and crouched beside Elias, her weathered face grim. She ignored the soldiers completely. She opened a leather pouch and began packing the wound with dark, strong-smelling herbs. "He is not gone yet," she said, her voice sharp. "But he will be if we do not stop the bleeding." Adeline swallowed her fear and her rage. "Tell me what to do." Together, the two women worked, binding the wound, forcing a bitter liquid between Elias's clenched teeth. Jacob and his soldiers watched, a silent, menacing wall of blue and brass. They were waiting, assessing. "Captain Breyer," one of his men said, "what are your orders?" Jacob's eyes were still locked on Adeline, on her hands stained with Elias's blood, on the way she touched him, with a desperate tenderness that twisted like a knife in Jacob's gut. He had come here on a mission, following whispers of a renegade Comanche band. He had never, in his wildest nightmares, expected to find her at the center of it. And he had never expected the revelation that was about to shatter his entire world. He opened his mouth to give the order to disarm the savages, to take Adeline into custody, but he was cut off by one of the older Comanche warriors. The man stepped forward, his face a mask of grief and fury. He pointed a trembling finger, not at Jacob, but at Elias. "He brings nothing but death!" the warrior cried out in broken English. "The white man's curse follows him. First the raiders, now the army. His blood is poison." Before anyone could react, the warrior lunged, a knife flashing in his hand, aiming for Elias's exposed throat. Elias's eyes flew open. Even wounded, his instincts were faster than thought. He rolled, dodging the blade, but the movement tore his wounds open. He cried out, a raw sound of pure agony. Jacob, seeing the woman he still believed he loved in danger, finally acted. He drew his service revolver. "Stand down!" he yelled. But it was too late. The camp, which had been united against the raiders, was now turning on itself. The fragile peace was broken. Some of the warriors moved to defend Elias. Others sided with the attacker, their fear and suspicion of Elias's mixed blood boiling over. It was chaos, a civil war erupting in the shadow of an invasion. And then, Elias, propped up on one elbow, his face pale as death, looked past the chaos, past the angry warriors, and stared directly at Jacob. "Breyer," he rasped, his voice choked with pain. "Your father, General Marcus Breyer, did he send you?" Jacob froze, his gun still raised. The world seemed to stop spinning. How do you know my father's name?" Elias coughed, a spray of blood dotting his lips. "Because he is my father, too." Silence. A profound, earth-shattering silence fell over the valley. The Comanche warriors stopped fighting. The soldiers lowered their rifles. Every eye was on the two men, the captain in his pristine blue uniform, and the savage bleeding in the dirt. Brothers. Jacob stared, his mind refusing to process the words. It was a trick, a lie, a savage's desperate attempt to save his own skin. His father was a general, a hero, a pillar of society. He could never. But then he saw it, in the hard line of Elias's jaw, in the shape of his eyes, in the stubborn pride that refused to break, even in the face of death. He was looking at a warped, weathered, wilderness-forged reflection of his own father, of himself. His entire world, his entire identity, was built on a lie. And Adeline, kneeling between them, finally understood. The hatred, the abandonment, the endless persecution of Elias. It was all personal. A powerful man in a faraway city, trying to erase a mistake from his past. A son he never claimed. Jacob stumbled back, his face ashen. "No," he whispered. "It's not possible." Elias fell back, his head hitting the dirt, unconscious. Tiva and Adeline rushed to his side, but the damage was done. The secret was out. The Comanche warriors looked at Elias's still form, with a new kind of horror. He wasn't just half-white. He was the son of the man whose army had pushed them from their lands, whose policies had starved their children. He was the son of their greatest enemy. And Jacob was no longer a captain on a mission. He was a man drowning, the foundations of his life washed away in a single devastating revelation. His mission here wasn't a coincidence. It was a command from his father, a quiet, unspoken order to eliminate a family secret. He hadn't been sent here to pacify a tribe. He had been sent here to kill his own brother. The revelation hung in the air, thick and poisonous, a truth more devastating than any bullet. Jacob stood as if turned to stone, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and horror. The soldiers behind him shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between their catatonic captain and the bleeding man on the ground. They had heard it too. The entire valley had heard it. The Comanche warriors were the first to react. The man who had attacked Elias backed away, his face a mask of shock, but others now looked at Elias's unconscious form with open hostility. Tiva, his aunt, stood over him like a she-bear, her eyes daring anyone to come closer. Adeline knew they had only moments. The fragile alliance was shattered. Jacob was a broken man, his authority gone. The soldiers were a powder keg without a leader, and the Comanche, betrayed and afraid, were about to explode. "Jacob!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. He flinched, his eyes slowly focusing on her. "Get your men out of here! Now!" I can't," he stammered, his voice hollow. "I have my orders." "Your orders were a lie," she shot back, her voice ringing with a certainty that even she didn't feel. "He sent you here to be his assassin, not his soldier. Can't you see that?" A flicker of something, shame, rage, grief, crossed Jacob's face. He looked at his hands, at the pistol he still held, as if seeing it for the first time. Suddenly, from the back of the cavalry patrol, a new voice barked out an order. "Captain Breyer is unwell. Sergeant, take command. Form a line. Prepare to fire." A burly, red-faced sergeant with a thick mustache pushed his way to the front. He saw the chaos, the divided natives, the dead sheriff, and his captain looking like a ghost. He saw an opportunity. "We will pacify this valley, with or without the captain's blessing," he roared. The soldiers, relieved to have orders, any orders, began to form a firing line. The metallic click-clack of rifles being cocked echoed through the valley. It was going to be a massacre. "No!" Adeline screamed, standing up, placing her own body in front of Elias. But then, a new sound. Hoofbeats, dozens of them, thundering down from the northern ridge, a war party. They burst from the trees, their faces painted for battle, their war cries splitting the air. They were Comanche, but not from this valley. And at their head, riding a fierce black war horse, was a man whose face was a mask of cold, vengeful fury. It was Cale, Elias's brother, the full-blooded Comanche who saw Elias as a traitor. He had come, but he hadn't come to save them. He and his warriors slammed into the flank of the soldiers' line, creating instant chaos. The neat firing line dissolved into a desperate, swirling melee of hand-to-hand combat. Cale himself leaped from his horse, 2 hatchets in his hands, and became a whirlwind of death among the blue-coated soldiers. He was not here to save Elias. He was here to kill the soldiers, to reclaim the land, and to erase the stain of his half-brother's existence by any means necessary. The valley floor became a 3-way slaughterhouse. Soldiers fighting Cale's warriors, Elias's people fighting to defend their homes, and Adeline, caught in the middle of it all, trying to keep a dying man alive. She looked at Jacob, who was still standing there, paralyzed by the horror of it all. "Jacob, you have to stop this," she pleaded. "You are the only one who can." Her words seemed to finally break through his shock. He looked at the carnage, at his men being cut down, at the people he had been sent to destroy fighting with the ferocity of cornered wolves. He looked at Adeline, her face streaked with dirt and blood, and at the man who was his brother. And he made a choice. He raised his pistol to the sky and fired 2 shots, the signal for retreat. "Fall back!" he screamed, his voice raw with anguish. Fall back to the ridge! The sergeant, his face bleeding from a deep gash, turned on him. Captain, we can win this! That's an order, Sergeant! Jacob roared, finding his voice, finding his authority. Fall back! The soldiers, battered and broken, began a disorganized retreat, dragging their wounded with them. Kale's warriors, sensing victory, pressed their attack, but they didn't follow the soldiers out of the valley. Their fight was for this land, not the world beyond it. As the last of the soldiers disappeared over the ridge, an eerie silence fell. The valley was littered with the bodies of raiders, soldiers, and Comanche. Kale stood over the body of the red-faced sergeant, his chest heaving, his hatchets dripping with blood. His eyes found Adeline. Then they moved to the still form of Elias. There was no victory in his gaze, only a deep, cold hatred. I have cleansed this land of the white soldiers, he said, his voice hard as flint. Now, I will cleanse it of their blood. He started walking towards them, his intention clear. He was going to finish what the bullet and the blade had started. He was going to kill his brother. Adeline stood up, the empty pistol still in her hand. She placed herself between Kale and Elias. Tiva and the other warriors from the valley formed a loose circle around them, their faces grim, their loyalties torn. You will not touch him, Adeline said, her voice shaking but steady. Kale stopped, his lip curling in a sneer. He is a disease, the son of our enemy. His very existence is an insult to the memory of our mother. Stand aside, white woman. No, she said. He is your brother. I have no brother, Kale spat. You're wrong, Adeline said, her mind racing. She had one card left to play, one desperate, impossible chance. He loves you. In his fever, he called your name. He said he was sorry. Kale flinched, a barely perceptible tremor. He never betrayed you, she pressed on, the words tumbling out. He was cast out just like you were. He has suffered just as much. The man who did this to you, to your mother, to him, is the same man. General Breyer. Your enemy is not Elias. It is his father. Our enemy is his father. Kale stared at her, his dark eyes searching her face, looking for the lie. He saw only a desperate, ragged truth. From the ridge above, a single horn blast echoed. The cavalry signaled a parley. Jacob appeared at the edge of the trees, alone, unarmed, his hands raised. He walked slowly, deliberately, into the valley of death he had helped create. He didn't stop until he was standing a few feet from Kale. The fighting is over, Jacob said, his voice hollow but clear. He wasn't speaking as a captain anymore. He was speaking as a man. He looked at Kale, then at the unconscious Elias. He is my blood. I will not let him be harmed. Kale laughed, a cold, empty sound. You have no say here, soldier. This is our land, our justice. Then let me offer you a different kind of justice, Jacob said. He unpinned the silver eagle insignia from his uniform and held it out. My father, the general, he values his name, his honor, above all else, more than his sons. He looked at Adeline, a deep, profound sadness in his eyes. A scandal would destroy him, a story about a secret family, a massacre, a captain who defied orders. It would be the end of his career, the end of his legacy. Adeline understood instantly. Blackmail. A truce, Jacob corrected softly. I will report this valley as barren, uninhabitable. I will bury the records. I will erase this place from the army's maps. In return, you let my men go. You let him, he nodded towards Elias, live, and none of us ever speak of what happened here today. It was a breathtaking gamble, an offer of mutual destruction or mutual survival. Kale stared at Jacob, then at Elias, then at Adeline. He looked at the bodies of his fallen warriors. He looked at the faces of the people of the valley who were watching him, waiting for his decision. He was a warrior, but he was not a fool. He knew a war with the U.S. Army was a war they could not win. He slowly, deliberately, lowered his bloody hatchets. Get your wounded and go, he said to Jacob, his voice a low growl, and never return. If I ever see your face, or the face of any soldier in this valley again, I will send your father your head in a box. Jacob nodded once. He turned to Adeline. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and the words held the weight of 1,000 unspoken regrets. For everything. Then he turned and walked away, a ghost returning to a world where he no longer belonged. The valley was quiet once more. Kale looked at Adeline, his expression unreadable. "You," he said, "are a fierce spirit. My brother chose, well." He didn't finish. He simply turned to his warriors. "We will make camp on the far ridge. We will watch." He was not offering friendship. He was offering a ceasefire, a chance. As Kale and his men departed, Adeline fell to her knees beside Elias, her strength finally giving out. Tiva was already tending to him, her hands gentle and sure. "He will live," the old woman said, not looking up. "He is a fighter, like his mother, and like his wife." Adeline looked at the man she had crossed the world for, the man for whom she had fought and killed and bargained. He was her home. He was her heart. They had survived. But the world was full of monsters, and she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that General Marcus Breyer was not a man who would let a secret stay buried for long. He had tried to erase Elias once. He would try again. The peace they had bought with blood and secrets was a fragile, temporary thing, and the cost of it was a debt that was not yet paid in full. In the days that followed, the valley became a place of ghosts and whispers. They buried the dead, raiders, soldiers, and Comanche alike, in a common, unmarked grave on the hillside. There were no prayers, only a heavy, shared silence. The cost of their survival was written on the faces of the living. Kale and his warriors remained on the far ridge, a silent, watchful presence. They did not help, but they did not hinder. It was a cold truce, a promise kept at a distance. Elias drifted in a sea of fever, his life hanging by a thread. Adeline and Tiva were his constant anchors, fighting for him with herbs, prayers, and sheer force of will. Adeline rarely left his side, whispering stories to him, telling him of the future they would build, forcing him to hold on. On the 7th day he woke. His eyes, clear and lucid, found hers. "Adeline," he rasped. Tears of relief streamed down her face. "You came back to me." "I told you I would," he whispered, his hand weakly finding hers. "What happened?" She told him everything. About the sheriff, about the battle, about Jacob and the impossible revelation. She told him about Kale's arrival and the deal Jacob had made. He listened without speaking, his expression growing darker with each word. "So my father sent my brother to kill me," he said finally, the words flat and dead. "And my other brother wanted to do the job himself." He closed his eyes. "It seems my blood is a curse after all." "No," Adeline said fiercely, her grip tightening on his hand. "Your blood is just blood. It's the men who are the curse, and we are not going to let them win." As Elias slowly regained his strength, a new order began to form in the valley. The two Comanche groups, Elias's people and Kale's warriors, began a cautious, wary dance of coexistence. They traded goods, shared hunting grounds, but never fires. The wound between the two brothers was too deep, too raw. But Adeline became a bridge. She would walk to Kale's camp, bringing offerings of cooked meat or mended clothes. He would accept them with a gruff nod, his eyes always guarded. He never spoke of Elias. He spoke of the weather, of the deer herds, and once he asked her to tell him a story about her mother's books, a small crack in his wall of hate. Months passed, the valley healed, the grass grew over the graves. A baby was born. Life, stubborn and relentless, was returning. Adeline and Elias built a new home, a small, sturdy cabin near the river, and for the first time, they allowed themselves to imagine a future. Then the letter came. It was delivered by a lone army courier, a young, nervous boy who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. The letter was sealed with the official crest of the War Department, and it was addressed to Captain Jacob Breyer, in care of the Northern Valley Anomaly. Jacob had vanished after the battle. No one had heard from him. The courier explained that he had been ordered to deliver the letter to the valley itself, to whoever was in charge. Adeline opened it with trembling hands. It was from General Marcus Breyer. The words were cold, precise, and utterly chilling. "Son," it began, "your failure to execute your orders has been noted. Your dereliction of duty and subsequent desertion have brought shame upon this family and this army. I have disowned you. You are no longer my son. However, the situation in the northern valley remains unresolved. The stain must be cleansed. I have dispatched a new company, under the command of a man who will not fail me. They have one order, to leave no survivors. Burn the valley to the bedrock. Erase the mistake. You had a chance to fix this quietly. Now, it will be fixed with fire and blood. This is the price of your weakness." Adeline's blood ran cold. The general wasn't just coming for Elias. He was coming for everyone. Cale, Tiva, the children. He was going to sterilize the earth to protect his reputation. She ran, the letter clutched in her hand, to find Elias. She found him by the river, teaching a young boy how to fish. She showed him the letter. He read it, and a terrifying stillness came over him. The quiet, deadly calm she had seen the day he fought the outlaws. "He will not stop," Elias said, his voice a low growl, "until I am dead." "Then we fight," Adeline said. "We can't," he replied, his face grim. "Not a full company. They will have cannons. We would be slaughtered." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible, resolute pain. "There is only one way." "What?" she asked, her heart sinking. "He wants me," Elias said. "He only wants me. If I am gone, he might call them off." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "Elias, no. You can't mean you're going to just let them take you." "I am not going to let them take me," he said, and she saw the plan in his eyes. He was going to face them. Alone. A suicide mission to draw them away, to buy his people, his family, time to escape. "I won't let you," she cried. "You must," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "Adeline, you are the leader here now. You are the one they trust. The bridge between the two peoples. You must get them away from here. Take them north, through the high passes. Lose them in the mountains." He pulled her close, his forehead pressing against hers. "Everything I have done since the day I met you has been to keep you safe. Let me do this. Let me do this one last thing." That night the valley held a council. Adeline, her voice breaking but her resolve iron, read the general's letter to the elders and to Cale, who had come down from his ridge. Cale's face was a mask of thunder. "The butcher sends his dogs," he snarled. He looked at Elias. "So you will run to meet them? A noble death?" "A necessary one," Elias said quietly. "No," Cale said, shocking everyone. "My warriors will ride with you." Elias stared at his brother. "Why?" "Because he is not just your father," Cale said, his hand resting on the hilt of his hatchet. "He is the man who destroyed my mother. My vengeance is not yet complete. We will meet his army together." It was not forgiveness. It was a shared hatred. But it was enough. The next morning, as the sun rose, Elias and Cale rode out of the valley, followed by a small, determined war party. Adeline watched them go, her heart a cold, hard stone in her chest. Before he left, Elias had kissed her, a long, desperate kiss filled with unspoken goodbyes. "I will find you," he had whispered, "in this life or the next. I will always find you." Now she had to save their people. She turned to Tiva, to the worried faces of the women and children. "Pack what you can carry," she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. "We go north. Now." The exodus began. A long, sad trail of people leaving their homes, their pasts, their hearts behind. They traveled for days, pushing deeper and deeper into the unforgiving mountains. Every night, Adeline would climb to the highest point she could find and look south, watching for the telltale glow of fires, for the smoke of a battle she prayed would never end. Then, after a week of travel, a lone rider appeared behind them. It was one of Cale's warriors, his face grim, his horse exhausted. "It is done," he said. "We met them in the narrow pass. We held them, but there were too many." "Elias," Adeline whispered, her heart stopping. "Cale?" The warrior shook his head. They fought back to back. Brothers, at the end. The army was breaking through. They sent me to tell you that they had bought you the time you needed. They told me to tell you. To live. The warrior's voice broke. They were overrun. Adeline didn't cry. She didn't scream. A part of her simply died. The world went gray. The man who was her home was gone. The brothers, united only in death, had made the ultimate sacrifice. But she had a promise to keep. She had to live. She had to lead these people to safety. She turned her face to the north and kept walking, a ghost leading the broken-hearted into the frozen wilderness. But what she didn't know, what the warrior didn't know, was that one man had survived the massacre in the pass, battered, broken, and left for dead under a pile of his fallen comrades. Jacob. He had heard of the new company being sent, and he had ridden back, not as a soldier, but as a man seeking redemption. He had arrived just in time to see the battle, to see the two brothers fighting and dying together. And when the army had moved on, he had crawled from the wreckage, the sole witness to the general's final bloody act. And now, he had a new purpose. It wasn't redemption. It was revenge. He held in his heart the story that could destroy his father, and he was going to make sure the world heard it. The long winter was a trial of ice and sorrow. Adeline led her people, a tribe of two families now bonded by shared grief, to a hidden valley deep in the northern mountains, a place so remote even the wind seemed to lose its way. They survived on what they could hunt, their spirits as frozen as the land around them. Adeline moved through the days like an automaton, her heart a hollow, aching void. She had kept her promise. They were safe. But the cost had been her soul. Spring came, and with it, a stranger. A lone white man, leading a tired horse, stumbled into their valley. The warriors surrounded him instantly, spears raised. But Adeline recognized him. It was the young army courier who had delivered the general's letter. He was thin, ragged, and his eyes held a haunted look. He was carrying a bundle of newspapers. He sought her out, pressing one into her hands. I thought you should see this," he said. The headline was explosive, printed in bold black letters that screamed across the front page of the New York Tribune. General Breyer's secret war, massacre, corruption, and a family's dark secret exposed. Adeline's hands trembled as she read. The story, written by an anonymous source identified only as a disgraced son, laid everything bare. The affair with the Comanche woman. The two sons, one acknowledged, one abandoned. The bounty on Adeline, the first battle, the cover-up, and the final, brutal massacre in the pass, an illegal military action ordered by the general to cleanse a stain on his family name. It was all there. Jacob had done it. He had gotten his revenge. The article detailed the political firestorm in Washington. General Breyer was ruined, facing a court-martial, his career and reputation utterly destroyed. The story had become a national scandal, a symbol of the government's brutal and often hidden war against the native peoples. In the final paragraph, the article mentioned that, due to the public outcry, the War Department had officially declared the entire northern mountain region a protected sovereign territory for the surviving members of the Valley tribe as a form of restitution. They were free. Truly, finally free. The land was theirs. No one would ever hunt them again. The news spread through the camp. There was no celebration, only a quiet, somber relief. The ghosts of their dead had bought them their freedom. Adeline walked to the highest peak overlooking their new home, the newspaper clutched in her hand. She looked out at the vast, beautiful, empty land. She had won. They had won. So why did it feel so much like she had lost? She lived for many years after that. She never remarried. She became the matriarch of the valley, a wise and respected leader known as the woman who stood. She taught the children to read from her mother's books and to shoot with her rifle. She told them the story of the brave warriors who had saved them. She told them of Cale. And she told them of Elias. She grew old. Her hair turned the color of the winter snow. Her face became a map of her long, hard life. And she was content. But she was never whole. A piece of her remained buried in that southern pass, with the man who was her home. One day, when she was a very old woman, her eyes faded and her steps slow, a group of travelers was brought to her. They were a family, a man and a woman, and their children, who had been given permission to pass through the protected lands. The man was a historian, collecting stories. He sat with her by the fire, and she told him her story, her voice a soft, reedy whisper. He listened, his eyes wide, scribbling notes in a small leather-bound book. When she was finished, he looked at her with a deep, compassionate respect. "It's an incredible story," he said. "A story of survival, of love." He paused. "My grandfather used to tell a version of it. He was a soldier, a long time ago. He deserted after a terrible battle. He changed his name, moved west, and never spoke of his family again. But he used to tell us about a woman he once knew. A woman named Adeline." Adeline's old, tired heart gave a sudden, painful lurch. The historian smiled sadly. He said she was the bravest person he ever met, and he said he was sorry he left her. He reached into his bag and pulled out an old, faded photograph in a tarnished silver frame. This was him. He handed it to her. She looked down at the image. It was a young man in a cavalry uniform, his face handsome and proud, but with a deep sadness in his eyes. It was Jacob. "He lived a good life," the historian said softly. "A quiet one. He said he owed it to the brother he never knew." Adeline stared at the photograph, the past rushing back in a tidal wave. She had never known what became of him. She had never wanted to. She handed the picture back to the man. "Thank you for showing me," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Later that night, Adeline sat outside her cabin, looking up at the stars. She thought of Elias. She thought of Jacob. She thought of the strange, violent, beautiful tapestry of her life. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in a very, very long time, she didn't feel the ache of loss. She felt peace. A quiet, gentle peace. Her story was over. Her promise was kept, and she knew, with a certainty that warmed her old bones, that somewhere in the land beyond the stars, he was waiting for her. And he would know the way. He would always know the way. They tried to trade her like property. They tried to erase him as a savage. But together, they forged a legacy out of the fire of a world that tried to burn them down. They proved that home isn't a place you are given. It's a place you build, a place you defend, a place you earn with blood and hope and love. And their story is a powerful reminder that even in the harshest wilderness, in the face of the cruelest hate, the most powerful force in the universe isn't a weapon or an army. It's the simple, stubborn, unbreakable will to stay. If this story moved you, and you believe that everyone deserves a place to call home, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You never know whose story we'll uncover next.